Fred and Rose West seemed like an ordinary couple. However, behind closed doors, they spent 2 decades committing horrific crimes, abusing and murdering at least 10 young women, including 2 of their own daughters. Netflix's Fred and Rose West, a British horror story, revisits their infamous story, featuring more than 100 previously unheard police tapes and shedding new light on one of the UK's most disturbing serial killer cases. Watch Fred and Rose West, a British horror story on Netflix, The Making of Monsters. Fred West was born on December 29, 1941, in Much Marcle, Herefordshire, England. From the very beginning, his life was far from ordinary. He grew up in a household riddled with abuse, neglect, and instability. Fred's father, Fred West SR, was reportedly strict, often violent, and deeply controlling, while his mother, Charlotte, struggled to manage her husband's temper and maintain a sense of normalcy in the home. As a child, Fred was frequently exposed to extreme forms of punishment and witnessed disturbing incidents that would leave lasting psychological scars. It was in this turbulent environment that some experts believe the seeds of his later violent tendencies were planted, though nothing could justify the horrors that would eventually unfold. From a young age, Fred exhibited troubling behavior. Neighbors and teachers occasionally noticed signs of aggression and emotional detachment, but these early warning signs were largely dismissed. He engaged in petty theft, vandalism, and even acts of sexualized behavior that were alarming for a child. Fred's fascination with violence and control became apparent during adolescence, and those around him began to describe him as charming yet unnerving, a combination that would later aid him in deceiving the public. Rose West, born in 1953 in North Devon, had her own traumatic childhood. Allegations of sexual abuse and severe family dysfunction marked her early years. Her father, a heavy drinker, was known to engage in inappropriate behavior toward his children, while her mother was unable or unwilling to intervene. Rose grew up navigating a world of fear and manipulation, which shaped her personality into one that was outwardly confident and charismatic, yet inwardly submissive and vulnerable to control. These traits would eventually allow her to become a willing partner in Fred's crimes, rather than a passive bystander. Fred and Rose met in the late 1960s when Fred was already married and had 2 children. He worked various odd jobs, including painting and general labor, while Rose was a young woman barely out of her teens. The attraction between them was immediate, fueled by Fred's charisma and Rose's fascination with his confidence. However, from the start, their relationship was fraught with disturbing dynamics. Fred's controlling tendencies and emerging sexual deviance surfaced quickly, and Rose, conditioned by her own traumatic past, seemed to accept and even encourage them. Their bond was a complex mix of passion, domination, and shared darkness, a partnership that would eventually evolve into a deadly criminal enterprise. By 1972, Fred and Rose were married and living together in Gloucester, England. They would go on to have 6 children. At first glance, they seemed to be a normal couple. Neighbors saw a family that attended local events, participated in the community, and maintained the outward appearance of domestic stability. But behind closed doors, the West household was anything but normal. Fred's abusive tendencies escalated, and Rose became increasingly complicit. The couple began targeting young women for sexual assault, starting a chain of horrific crimes that would last for decades. The first known victims were teenage girls who were either neighbors or acquaintances. Fred's charm and apparent normalcy allowed him to lure them into dangerous situations, where he could exert complete control. Rose's role in these early stages was equally sinister. She often acted as a manipulator, convincing victims to trust them and even participating directly in their abuse. The West's home, modest and unassuming to outsiders, was being transformed into a space of terror. Certain rooms were designated for abuse, and areas like the basement became sites where the couple could carry out their violent acts in secrecy. Fred and Rose developed a systematic approach to their crimes. Fred would entice victims with promises of gifts, shelter, or employment, carefully grooming them to ensure compliance. Once inside their home, the victims faced physical violence, psychological manipulation, and sexual assault. Over time, these assaults escalated to murder. The couple's partnership was essential to their criminal activities. Fred provided the force and initiative, while Rose provided cunning, manipulation, and an outwardly normal facade that allowed the couple to operate without suspicion. The children in the household were not spared. They lived under constant fear, witnessing horrific acts or, in some cases, being forced into complicity. Many of the children were subjected to abuse themselves, creating a deeply traumatic environment. Rose, despite being a mother, actively participated in these acts, ensuring that the children remained under the strict control of both parents. The household became a twisted microcosm of domination and terror, where innocence was systematically destroyed. Neighbors occasionally noticed unusual activity. Some girls went missing, strange noises were heard, and the children's behavior often seemed odd or withdrawn. Yet Fred and Rose were adept at maintaining appearances. They hosted neighbors, attended community events, and presented themselves as a seemingly normal family. This duality, charming outwardly, monstrous behind closed doors, allowed the Wests to continue their crimes undetected for years. The couple's early murders were brutal and calculated. Victims were often strangled, beaten, or suffocated, with their bodies hidden inside the house or disposed of elsewhere. Each act of violence reflected not only a desire for control, but also a disturbing ritualistic tendency, as if the crime itself was part of a personal obsession. Their victims were increasingly younger, and the couple's methods of concealment grew more sophisticated, making detection by law enforcement extremely difficult. By the late 1970s, Fred and Rose had become more audacious. They were brazen in their actions, targeting young girls and turning their home into a macabre chamber of horrors. Their crimes had become routine, yet they continued to present themselves as loving parents and engaged community members. The dual life they led was chilling in its audacity. Friends and neighbors would later describe shock and disbelief when the scale of the West's atrocities finally came to light. How could such horrors have been committed in plain sight, in a seemingly normal household? Their relationship was at the center of their criminal enterprise. Unlike many serial killers who act alone, Fred and Rose functioned as a unit. Fred's sadistic tendencies were amplified by Rose's active participation, creating a dark symbiosis where each reinforced the other's depravity. Fred's physical dominance and Rose's cunning manipulation allowed them to maintain control over both victims and family members. Over time, their partnership became one of the most infamous examples of a criminal duo in history. By the early 1980s, the West's pattern of crime had solidified. Victims were carefully selected, lured, and murdered with terrifying regularity. The children continued to live in a state of constant fear and trauma, sometimes coerced into assisting or witnessing acts of abuse. Despite occasional suspicions from neighbors, Fred and Rose's outward charm and the appearance of a normal family life provided them with cover. They had mastered the art of deception, hiding unspeakable horrors behind an ordinary facade. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the West's crimes were not random acts of violence, but a systematic, escalating campaign of terror. Over the next decade, they would commit a series of murders that included at least 10 young women, including some of their own children. Their actions left a permanent scar on Gloucester and became one of the most infamous serial killer cases in the United Kingdom. The story of Fred and Rose West is a chilling reminder of how extreme abuse, manipulation, and evil can hide behind even the most ordinary appearances, secrets and shadows. By the late 1970s, Fred and Rose West had firmly established themselves as a terrifying presence behind the walls of their Gloucester home. While neighbors saw a typical, seemingly loving family, the couple's private life was dominated by control, fear, and escalating violence. Their home, outwardly ordinary, had become a dark labyrinth, hiding unimaginable horrors. Rooms that looked like any other space were repurposed to isolate and control their victims, making the house itself a tool of terror. Fred West had an uncanny ability to charm and manipulate those around him. Many of his victims were young women, often in vulnerable situations, runaways, friends of the family, or girls seeking temporary shelter. Fred would gain their trust, promising help, guidance, or a place to stay. To them, he appeared as a protective and confident figure. Rose West complimented Fred's tactics. She would welcome these girls into their home, creating an illusion of safety. Once the girls were inside, the reality of the West household was a terrifying contrast. The couple maintained complete control over their victims and over the children, who were themselves trapped in a climate of fear. The West children were subjected to strict, often cruel rules. Some were witnesses to the couple's acts of control over outsiders. Others were coerced into assisting or participating in enforcing fear. Psychological trauma was constant. Children lived in a household where compliance was necessary for survival, and any sign of defiance could provoke severe consequences. Rose, acting as both mother and enforcer, ensured that the household functioned according to her and Fred's rules, cementing a climate of fear and obedience. Over time, the West's methods became increasingly methodical. Victims were often detained or controlled to prevent escape, and rooms were modified to serve specific functions. The basement, for example, became a recurring place where victims were confined. Fred's dominance, combined with Rose's organizational skills, allowed them to maintain complete control over the household, and their home became both a prison and a stage for their disturbing activities. The couple's ability to maintain a normal exterior while orchestrating such horrors inside was one of their most chilling traits. Neighbors occasionally noticed oddities, strange visitors at unusual hours, young girls disappearing from local areas, or noises from the house. Despite these suspicions, the West's outward charm and community involvement allowed them to deflect attention. They attended social events, participated in community gatherings, and maintained the appearance of a stable family. Their duplicity, the juxtaposition of domestic normalcy with private terror, allowed their crimes to continue undetected for years. The psychological manipulation employed by the Wests was extensive. Victims were often isolated, coerced, or intimidated, creating a sense that resistance was impossible. The couple's children were similarly conditioned to obey, becoming both observers and reluctant participants in the household's dark routines. Rose's role in this manipulation was critical. She acted as the mediator between Fred's aggressive tendencies and the children, enforcing rules and ensuring that the household's hidden hierarchy remained intact. The West's crimes extended to murder, often carried out with methodical planning. Victims were detained, controlled, and ultimately killed, with bodies hidden in concealed areas of the house, the garden, or behind walls. Evidence suggests that Fred and Rose had developed a systematic approach, demonstrating chilling forethought and organization. Over time, the number of victims increased, as did the frequency of their crimes, reflecting a growing sense of impunity. The house itself became a repository for secrets that were almost impossible for outsiders to detect. Despite the scale of their crimes, Fred and Rose West were able to maintain social normality. They were courteous to neighbors, participated in local events, and presented themselves as a loving family. This ability to appear normal made it difficult for authorities to detect patterns early on. Missing person reports were filed in the community, but connections between disappearances were not immediately obvious. The West's outward normalcy shielded them from scrutiny, allowing their hidden world of terror to persist for years. By the early 1980s, the couple's pattern of crime had become routine. Victims were carefully chosen, brought into the home, controlled, and ultimately killed. Their children remained trapped in a household dominated by fear and manipulation. Survivors and later accounts describe a household where obedience was mandatory, resistance met with intimidation or punishment, and terror governed daily life. The West's actions demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, exploiting vulnerabilities and fear to maintain dominance. Law enforcement slowly began to take notice as patterns of missing girls accumulated. Reports of disappearances, coupled with hints from neighbors and acquaintances, raised suspicions about the West household. Still, the couple's outward normality continued to mask the full extent of their crimes. Investigators lacked the technology, forensic techniques, and sometimes the evidence to immediately connect the Wests to the disappearances. This combination of careful concealment and community integration allowed them to evade capture for many years. Fred and Rose's partnership was central to their criminal enterprise. Fred's aggressive tendencies and desire for control were amplified by Rose's participation, while Rose's cunning and outwardly normal persona allowed them to manipulate both victims and authorities. Together, they perfected a system of abuse, murder, and concealment, creating a household where control and fear were absolute. Their collaboration was unusual among serial offenders, marking the Wests as one of the most notorious criminal duos in modern history. By the end of this period, the Wests' house had become a grim symbol of hidden terror. Victims were trapped and controlled, children lived under constant fear, and neighbors remained largely unaware of the atrocities taking place behind closed doors. Though some early suspicions had emerged, the couple's ability to hide their crimes allowed them to continue operating with impunity. The Wests' combination of meticulous planning, social charm, and psychological manipulation created a dangerous paradox, outwardly ordinary, yet hiding extraordinary evil within the home. As the 1980s progressed, the Wests' network of control and secrecy began to strain under the weight of their crimes. Reports of missing girls, unusual neighborhood activity, and growing unease within the community slowly set the stage for deeper investigation. The eventual unraveling of their crimes would expose the horrifying scale of their actions and reveal one of the most chilling serial killer cases in United Kingdom history. The walls begin to crack. By the mid-1980s, the Wests' crimes had reached a level of audacity that few could imagine. Their home in Gloucester had become more than a residence. It was a hidden chamber of terror, carefully engineered to confine and control their victims. For years, Fred and Rose had perfected a pattern of luring young women into a false sense of safety, manipulating them psychologically, and ultimately causing their deaths. The couple's children continued to live in fear, caught between their parents' control and the horrors happening around them. Some of the victims were young women who had run away from troubled homes or were seeking temporary refuge. Others were acquaintances of the family, girls who had trusted the Wests. Fred's charm and seemingly protective demeanor were crucial tools in luring victims, while Rose's participation gave an additional layer of credibility and manipulation. Survivors' accounts later revealed the complexity of the West household, a place where trust was weaponized and fear was enforced systematically. One of the victims who drew attention in later investigations was Anne McFall, a teenage girl who had been living nearby. Though she survived, her brief time in the West household exposed the couple's control tactics. She described how Fred would isolate girls, instill fear through strict rules, and punish disobedience severely. Rose's complicity often involved organizing the household, ensuring that the children were complicit or kept in line, and making sure the victims could not escape. Anne's testimony later became critical in understanding the dynamics of the West household. Another case involved Patricia, a neighbor's daughter, who had spent time at the West home under the pretense of friendship. She described the chilling normalcy of the house's exterior versus the oppressive and frightening environment inside. Victims were often moved from room to room, their routines controlled down to the smallest detail, creating an environment where resistance seemed impossible. Through psychological coercion, manipulation, and fear, the Wests maintained absolute control over anyone who entered their home. By the late 1980s, patterns of missing girls in Gloucester began to attract attention from local authorities. While the Wests were careful to conceal evidence, reports from survivors, neighbors, and family members slowly began to build a case for suspicion. Authorities noticed repeated disappearances of young women with connections to the West household. While initial investigations lacked the forensic tools available today, law enforcement began to see troubling patterns emerge, indicating that something far more sinister was occurring behind the West's closed doors. The escalation of police interest coincided with increasingly reckless behavior from the couple. Fred, in particular, had become more brazen. He was reportedly more careless in his attempts to conceal victims and increasingly relied on intimidation rather than subtlety to control his household. Rose's role remained central. She coordinated the household, kept the children in line, and ensured that any signs of suspicion from outsiders were deflected. Together, the Wests operated with remarkable coordination, a disturbing combination of audacity and cunning that allowed them to evade detection for decades. The home itself had become a repository of evidence. Rooms once used for domestic life were converted into spaces for confinement and abuse. Basements, cellars, and hidden sections of the house stored clues that would later become central to the investigation. The Wests' meticulous concealment strategies initially frustrated police efforts, making it difficult to identify and connect the victims. Neighbors often noted unusual behavior, but the outward normality of the Wests' social life masked the full scope of their activities. By 1987, investigators had begun piecing together a web of disappearances and suspicious behavior. Some of the children, now older, started providing small clues about the household's dysfunction. Although initially hesitant to speak out due to fear of their parents, the children's eventual testimonies would prove crucial in building the case. Police interviews, community reports, and accumulating evidence finally began to form a pattern linking the West household to multiple disappearances. During this period, some victims began to escape or survive the West's control. These accounts provided law enforcement with the first concrete understanding of the West household's horrors. Survivors described the constant fear, the rules imposed by Fred and Rose, and the psychological manipulation used to maintain dominance. These first-hand testimonies began to illuminate the horrifying combination of control, abuse, and murder orchestrated by the couple. One key breakthrough came when neighbors reported unusually frequent activity at odd hours and a pattern of young girls appearing at the West home only to disappear shortly afterward. While not immediately actionable, these observations helped authorities narrow their focus on the household. Investigators began to suspect that the Wests were more than ordinary perpetrators of domestic abuse. They might be responsible for multiple disappearances spanning decades. The escalation of suspicion forced the Wests into increasingly desperate measures. They began altering the home more extensively, concealing rooms and creating secret spaces to hide evidence. Victims were moved more frequently, and the couple became increasingly careful about who had access to the home. Yet despite these precautions, subtle cracks in their carefully constructed facade began to appear, setting the stage for eventual discovery. As investigators dug deeper, they began interviewing neighbors, friends, and family. Stories of abuse, intimidation, and suspicious behavior gradually emerged. Former acquaintances described a family that outwardly seemed normal, but had an eerie atmosphere behind closed doors. The consistent reports of disappearances and disturbing accounts from children and surviving victims created enough suspicion for authorities to escalate their investigation. By the late 1980s, the Wests' house had become the focal point of one of the most intense investigations in Gloucester's history. Law enforcement began using both modern investigative techniques and witness testimonies to create a clearer picture of the household. Although the Wests continued to present themselves as ordinary citizens, the evidence was beginning to mount against them. The turning point was the careful examination of the home itself. Basements, hidden sections of walls, and other concealed spaces revealed clues that hinted at the scale of the crimes. Investigators found that the home, which had appeared normal to neighbors, was in fact a site of systematic abuse and murder. While the full horror of the Wests' crimes was not yet apparent, these early discoveries confirmed investigators' suspicions that Fred and Rose were responsible for numerous disappearances and possible murders over decades. By the end of Part 3, the Wests' carefully constructed world of control and secrecy was beginning to unravel. Police attention, survivor testimonies, and accumulating evidence set the stage for the eventual exposure of one of the most chilling criminal duos in British history. The cracks in their facade were widening, and the horrors hidden behind the walls of 25 Cromwell Street were on the verge of being revealed to the world. The fall of the Wests. By 1992, suspicions surrounding Fred and Rose West had reached a tipping point. Over 2 decades of unchecked abuse and murder had created a trail of disappearances, survivor testimonies, and accumulating evidence that could no longer be ignored. Law enforcement, armed with improved investigative techniques, began focusing on the West household at 25 Cromwell Street. What had once been a carefully hidden chamber of horrors was about to be exposed to the public and the authorities alike. The investigation gained momentum when neighbors, friends, and relatives came forward with troubling accounts. They described the unusual comings and goings at the West home, the frequent appearance of young girls who later vanished, and the disturbing behavior of both Fred and Rose. Former residents and neighbors recounted stories that hinted at the systematic abuse occurring behind closed doors. The testimonies of the West children, once hesitant out of fear, were particularly important, providing detailed insight into the patterns of control, violence, and intimidation that had dominated their household. Authorities decided to carry out a detailed search of 25 Cromwell Street. It was immediately clear that the home held evidence of crimes far beyond ordinary domestic abuse. The investigation revealed hidden rooms, modified spaces, and areas of the house that had been specifically designed to confine victims. These discoveries were shocking, painting a grim picture of the calculated cruelty that had taken place within what had outwardly seemed like an ordinary family home. During the search, investigators uncovered remains that would become central to the prosecution. The bodies of several victims were found buried on the property, many concealed beneath the garden, floors, and patios. Forensic examination confirmed that these deaths had been deliberately caused, often through strangulation or blunt force trauma. The sheer number of victims discovered, combined with the evidence of sustained abuse, horrified both investigators and the public once the news broke. It became clear that the West's crimes were not isolated incidents, but a coordinated series of murders spanning decades. Fred West was arrested shortly after the initial discoveries, followed by Rose, who was implicated through her active participation in the household's operations. The arrests sent shockwaves through Gloucester and the wider United Kingdom. For years, the Wests had maintained a facade of normality, attending social events, participating in the community, and raising children. The revelation of their crimes forced a nation to confront the terrifying reality that monstrous acts had been occurring in plain sight, hidden by ordinary appearances. The ensuing investigation was meticulous and thorough. Authorities interviewed surviving victims, neighbors, and family members, creating a detailed timeline of the West's crimes. Each piece of evidence reinforced the narrative of systematic abuse and murder. The investigation also focused on forensic analysis, linking physical evidence from the home to missing persons reports and survivor testimonies. By compiling these elements, investigators built an irrefutable case demonstrating the extent of Fred and Rose West's depravity. As the trial approached, public interest was intense. Media coverage highlighted the shocking scale of the crimes, the methodical nature of the murders, and the couple's ability to maintain a normal exterior. Court proceedings were closely followed, with survivors providing testimony that detailed the abuse they had endured. The trial revealed not only the horrific acts themselves, but also the psychological manipulation that the Wests employed to control victims and family members alike. Rose's involvement was particularly scrutinized, as prosecutors demonstrated her active role in planning, executing, and concealing the crimes. Fred West faced charges for multiple murders, including the deaths of his stepdaughter Charmaine and several other young women. Evidence presented at trial demonstrated his calculated methods and the sustained pattern of violence. The testimony of survivors and former neighbors painted a vivid picture of the environment within the West household, one dominated by fear, control, and manipulation. Fred's demeanor in court, often calm and unrepentant, further shocked the public and reinforced the chilling nature of his crimes. Rose West's trial followed, focusing on her complicity in the murders, her role in controlling the household, and her direct participation in acts of abuse. Prosecutors emphasized her coordination with Fred, her enforcement of household rules, and her involvement in concealing evidence. Witnesses described the terror of life inside the West home, highlighting how Rose's outward normalcy had masked her active engagement in horrendous crimes. Her conviction underscored the reality that both partners had contributed equally to the systematic abuse and murder of young women. The public reaction to the trial was one of disbelief and horror. Many struggled to comprehend how such atrocities could occur within an apparently normal family home in a quiet English town. Media coverage, documentaries, and later books sought to explore the psychological and social dimensions of the West's crimes, attempting to understand the combination of trauma, manipulation, and sadistic behavior that had enabled two people to commit such acts over decades. The case also prompted discussions about societal awareness, the role of neighbors and authorities, and how patterns of abuse could remain hidden for so long. The convictions of Fred and Rose West marked a turning point in British criminal history. Fred West was sentenced to life imprisonment, facing charges for multiple murders, while Rose West received a similar sentence, reflecting her active role in the crimes. Fred later died in prison, ending any possibility of further revelations from him, but Rose remains incarcerated, serving her sentence and continuing to evoke public fascination and revulsion. Their legacy is one of extreme horror, serving as a grim reminder of the potential for evil to hide behind ordinary facades. Beyond the legal consequences, the case of Fred and Rose West had lasting effects on Gloucester and wider society. It prompted increased vigilance regarding missing persons, raised awareness about domestic abuse, and underscored the need for effective communication between communities and law enforcement. The psychological impact on surviving victims and the West children was profound, requiring years of therapy and support to begin healing. Aftermath and echoes of horror. The convictions of Fred and Rose West marked the end of their criminal activity, but the reverberations of their actions continued to be felt across Gloucester, the United Kingdom, and the world. The trial and subsequent sentencing brought a sense of legal closure, yet the emotional and psychological fallout for survivors, families, and the wider community was only beginning to surface. The West's crimes had left deep scars that extended far beyond the walls of 25 Cromwell Street. For the surviving victims, life after the West's capture was fraught with challenges. Many had endured years of physical and psychological trauma, coupled with a pervasive sense of fear instilled during their time in the household. Recovery required extensive therapy and support as survivors worked to regain a sense of safety, self-worth, and autonomy. Some struggled with trust, relationships, and the emotional consequences of having been trapped in an environment where fear and manipulation were daily constants. Counseling services, survivor networks, and community programs played a crucial role in helping individuals rebuild their lives. The West children also faced profound challenges. Having grown up in a household dominated by terror, manipulation, and abuse, they were forced to confront both their personal trauma and the public scrutiny that followed the trial. Therapy, long-term counseling, and supportive care became essential in addressing the psychological impact of living in such a household. The experiences of the West children highlighted the long-lasting consequences of familial abuse, particularly when compounded by exposure to extreme criminal behavior and violence. The trial itself, while bringing justice, had a lasting impact on public consciousness. Media coverage was extensive, with newspapers, television networks, and later documentaries chronicling the West's crimes in detail. Shows like Fred and Rose West, a British horror story, revisited the case with interviews, archival footage, and expert analysis, shedding light on previously unheard testimonies and police recordings. These narratives emphasized the importance of vigilance, community awareness, and the need for timely intervention when signs of abuse or criminal activity emerge. The broader societal impact of the West's case was profound. Law enforcement agencies across the UK reviewed protocols for investigating disappearances, domestic abuse, and potential serial offenses. The case illustrated how predators could operate for years by blending into communities, emphasizing the need for improved communication between police, social services, and the public. policy reforms were discussed, aiming to ensure that patterns of abuse or suspicious disappearances could be detected earlier, potentially preventing similar cases in the future. Survivor stories became a central element of the West case legacy. Individuals who had escaped or survived offered first-hand accounts of the terror within the West household. They described how fear was used as a tool of control, how obedience was enforced through intimidation, and how psychological manipulation kept victims trapped. Their narratives not only provided evidence for law enforcement, but also became a source of public education about recognizing signs of abuse and the dangers of hidden criminal activity. Forensic science played a critical role in the aftermath. Detailed analysis of the West's home, combined with autopsies and investigative techniques, allowed authorities to reconstruct events spanning decades. These forensic discoveries confirmed the systematic nature of the crimes and reinforced the understanding that the West's actions were planned, coordinated, and executed with deliberate cruelty. The findings became case studies in law enforcement and criminology courses, illustrating how evidence, witness testimony, and careful investigation can converge to solve complex criminal cases. Psychologists and criminologists have since examined the West's behavior to understand the dynamics of their criminal partnership. Fred West's dominance, manipulative charm, and coercive tactics were amplified by Rose's organizational skills, outward normalcy, and active participation. Together, they created a household where abuse, fear, and murder were normalized. Experts have analyzed their psychological profiles, exploring the factors that enabled two individuals to commit repeated crimes over decades without detection. These analyses have informed both law enforcement strategies and the study of serial offenders worldwide. The cultural impact of the West's crimes also extended into literature, film, and media. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and dramatizations have explored the case in detail, often focusing on the psychological and social aspects rather than explicit violence. These works aim to educate the public about the dangers of manipulation, the importance of vigilance, and the need to trust community instincts when suspicious behavior emerges. While the story is undeniably harrowing, it also serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of ignoring subtle signs of abuse and criminal activity. The West case also sparked discussions about media ethics. The intense coverage of the trial, the detailed recounting of victims' experiences, and the fascination with the West's household raised questions about how to balance public interest with sensitivity for survivors. Journalists and producers were challenged to present information accurately and responsibly, avoiding sensationalism while ensuring that the gravity of the crimes was fully understood. These discussions influenced how future high-profile criminal cases were covered in the UK and beyond. Another long-term consequence of the West's crimes was the heightened awareness of domestic abuse and child protection. Social services and child welfare organizations began to develop new strategies to detect, report, and intervene in situations where families exhibited patterns of manipulation, isolation, or coercion. The West case highlighted the importance of community involvement, communication between neighbors, and vigilance in protecting vulnerable individuals. Educational programs and public awareness campaigns often reference the West's as a case study in extreme abuse and the importance of early intervention. Psychological research also explored the lasting impact on those who were directly and indirectly affected. Survivors often experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming trusting relationships. The West children, having been raised in the household, faced compounded trauma, struggling with their own identities and coping with the knowledge of what their parents had done. The collective experiences of survivors and family members emphasized the long-term consequences of sustained abuse, shaping approaches to trauma-informed care and recovery. In the years following the trial, 25 Cromwell Street became a symbol of horror, eventually demolished to prevent it from becoming a macabre pilgrimage site. The physical erasure of the house reflected a societal desire to move past the location while preserving the memory of the victims. Memorials and educational materials now focus on remembering those who were lost, the lessons learned from the case, and the importance of preventing similar tragedies. By transforming the narrative from location to education, communities sought to honor the victims and promote vigilance against abuse. Fred and Rose West's case remains a powerful lesson in human behavior, criminal psychology, and the necessity of societal vigilance. It demonstrates how perpetrators can manipulate appearances, exploit vulnerabilities, and operate undetected for long periods. The story underscores the critical role of survivor testimony, forensic evidence, community awareness, and persistent law enforcement in uncovering crimes that otherwise might remain hidden. Even decades later, the West's crimes are studied as part of criminology, psychology, and law enforcement training. Documentaries, books, and educational programs revisit the case, highlighting the warning signs of abuse and the dynamics of serial criminal partnerships. Survivors' voices continue to shape public understanding, offering insight into both the horrors endured and the resilience required to survive. In the end, Part 5 reminds us that the legacy of Fred and Rose West extends beyond their convictions. It is a story of pain and survival, horror and revelation, fear and the resilience of the human spirit. While justice was served through the courts, the long-term impact on victims, families, and society remains a sobering reflection on how evil can hide in plain sight and the importance of vigilance, compassion, and action in protecting the most vulnerable. Legacy, lessons, and shadows. The horrors perpetrated by Fred and Rose West extended far beyond the walls of 25 Cromwell Street. Their crimes revealed not only the depths of human cruelty, but also the vulnerabilities within society that allowed such evil to go undetected for decades. In the aftermath of their arrests and convictions, Britain grappled with questions about how to identify warning signs, intervene early, and protect vulnerable individuals. The West case became a touchstone for discussions about abuse, community responsibility, and the limits of human trust. One of the most striking lessons from the West's crimes was the importance of vigilance within communities. Neighbors, schools, and local authorities often had pieces of the puzzle, but these clues went unconnected for years. The seemingly ordinary facade of the West household, a tidy home, friendly interactions, and participation in community events, masked the extraordinary danger within. Law enforcement and child protection agencies subsequently emphasized the importance of observing behavioral patterns, questioning inconsistencies, and following up on concerns even when no direct evidence is initially available. The psychological dimension of the West's behavior has also been widely studied. Fred West exhibited traits commonly associated with manipulative and sadistic offenders: charm, intelligence, and a deep understanding of how to exploit fear. His ability to identify vulnerabilities in young women, build trust, and then control or intimidate them over time reflected a calculated and methodical approach. In contrast, Rose West combined outward normality with cunning, organizational skills, and a willingness to participate actively in abuse. The partnership was symbiotic. Fred initiated violence and control, while Rose maintained the structure and enforced rules that kept victims trapped. Together, they created a household in which terror and obedience were constant. Criminologists have noted that the West's case illustrates the unique dangers of collaborative criminal partnerships. Unlike solo offenders, duos like the West's reinforce each other's behavior, creating a feedback loop that amplifies cruelty. Fred's aggression and dominance were complemented by Rose's manipulative abilities, allowing them to escalate crimes over time. Their shared depravity, combined with a mutual commitment to concealment, made detection by authorities extraordinarily difficult. Studying such dynamics has informed law enforcement practices, highlighting the need to consider family and household structures in investigations of repeated abuse or violent crimes. The West's crimes also had a profound impact on law enforcement procedures in the UK. Authorities began to develop more sophisticated methods for investigating serial offenders, including cross-referencing missing persons reports, tracking unusual behavior, and integrating forensic evidence more systematically. The case demonstrated the importance of listening to survivors, neighbors, and children, whose testimonies can provide critical insights into patterns of abuse. Training programs for police and social workers increasingly included lessons drawn from the West case, emphasizing vigilance, early intervention, and the recognition of manipulation and coercion as tools of control. Another lasting consequence of the West's actions was heightened public awareness of domestic abuse and child protection. Educational campaigns, school programs, and public service announcements began to incorporate examples from extreme cases like the West's to illustrate warning signs. Communities were encouraged to trust instincts, report concerns, and provide safe avenues for vulnerable individuals to seek help. The case reinforced the idea that abuse is rarely isolated, and that patterns often exist long before authorities become aware. It also underscored the importance of coordinated responses between police, social services, and local communities to prevent harm. The survivors of Fred and Rose West have played an essential role in shaping the legacy of the case. Their courage in coming forward, recounting traumatic experiences, and cooperating with authorities helped bring the Wests to justice. Beyond the courtroom, survivors became advocates for awareness, support, and systemic change. Their stories emphasized resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma and highlighted the importance of empathy, psychological care, and long-term support for victims of abuse. Through interviews, documentaries, and educational initiatives, survivors have ensured that the memory of the victims is preserved and that lessons are learned from their experiences. Media and literature have continued to explore the West's crimes, often focusing on psychological, social, and systemic dimensions rather than sensationalizing violence. Documentaries like Fred and Rose West, a British horror story, and numerous books offer in-depth analysis of the case, presenting both historical context and survivor perspectives. These works contribute to a nuanced understanding of the crimes, their impact on victims and families, and the societal factors that allowed the Wests to operate for so long. They also serve as cautionary tales, encouraging vigilance, awareness, and advocacy. The West case also prompted reflection on the role of trust in human society. Neighbors, teachers, and acquaintances often assumed the Wests were normal, responsible members of the community. This misplaced trust allowed abuse to continue unnoticed, highlighting the potential dangers of ignoring warning signs or assuming appearances reflect reality. The case has since been cited in discussions of social responsibility, community vigilance, and the importance of maintaining awareness of the vulnerabilities of children and marginalized individuals. The psychological trauma caused by the Wests has had intergenerational effects. Their children, exposed to abuse and terror, had to navigate not only the immediate aftermath, but also long-term consequences for mental health, relationships, and identity. Therapy and ongoing support were crucial for healing, but the shadow of the West household has persisted. Studying the impact on family members has informed practices in child protection and trauma care, emphasizing early intervention, family support, and the need to address both direct and indirect exposure to abuse. Even decades after the crimes, the West's story continues to resonate because it challenges assumptions about safety, normality, and human behavior. It is a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that evil can hide behind the most mundane facades. The case has informed law enforcement, social services, psychological research, and public awareness campaigns. It has become a benchmark for understanding the interplay between manipulation, coercion, violence, and concealment in serial criminal behavior. Finally, the West's legacy is inseparable from the victims and survivors. Memorials, educational programs, and media projects emphasize remembering those lost and learning from the past. The story serves not only as a record of horror, but also as a guide for protecting the vulnerable, understanding the complexities of abuse, and preventing future tragedies. By honoring the victims, listening to survivors, and applying lessons learned, society can ensure that the darkness of 25 Cromwell Street informs vigilance, compassion, and justice for generations to come. In conclusion, Part 6 highlights that while Fred and Rose West were brought to justice, the broader societal and psychological impact of their crimes continues. The West case serves as a study in evil, resilience, community responsibility, and the enduring need to protect the vulnerable. From survivor stories to law enforcement reforms, the lessons of the Wests remain deeply relevant, reminding us of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and the courage to confront darkness wherever it hides.